The old dog hadn't barked in weeks. In fact, Ranger had forgotten how. The only sounds he made now were the soft creaks of his bones, the heavy breaths he drew with difficulty, and the occasional whimper in the silence of the shelter. In his 19 years of life, he had faced battles, real ones with fire and smoke and the piercing cold of winter nights. But nothing had prepared him for this, to be forgotten. The wind cut through the thin walls of Montana Haven Animal Shelter like knives of ice, howling softly as it carried the distant cries of restless dogs and the hushed whimpers of those who had long since given up. The place, meant to be a haven, now felt more like a waiting room for forgotten lives. In a dark corner of the shelter, away from the younger dogs who still barked for attention, lay a shadow of what once had been a magnificent creature. Ranger, a German shepherd once full of strength and pride, now resembled a frail ghost of his former self. His once golden coat was now patchy and graying. His legs trembled when he stood, and his cloudy eyes stared into the void, unblinking, as if he no longer saw the world around him. He had given 19 years to his family, 19 years of unwavering loyalty, guarding their home, playing with their children, following them on every adventure. And when his legs had grown weak, when he could no longer run to the door or climb onto the porch, they left him here. Like an old chair no longer needed, no explanations, no goodbyes. Shelter worker Mia, a gentle soul with kind eyes, knelt beside his kennel, refilling his water bowl. Her voice broke the silence. "He barely drinks anymore," she said softly, almost to herself. From behind her, the shelter's owner, Ethan, crossed his arms. He stopped eating the moment he realized they weren't coming back. He just waits. Ranger didn't lift his head. He hadn't lifted it in weeks. He no longer cared who came and went, until the door creaked open, and Clara walked in. The moment the door opened, the soft jingle of keys and the quick shuffle of feet were enough to stir something deep within Ranger. His ears twitched, ever so slightly, but his eyes stayed closed, heavy with the weight of years, of memories, of abandonment. Clara Bennett hadn't planned on adopting a dog. She hadn't set foot in the shelter since her husband Daniel passed away a year ago. But something, maybe the crushing silence of her empty house, had drawn her back. She passed rows of eager barking dogs, but her gaze landed on the old shepherd in the far corner. His fur had lost its luster. His frame slumped. He didn't move, didn't even look up. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of the other dogs. Ethan exchanged a glance with Mia, both sensing the shift in the air. "That's Ranger, 19 years old. His family left him here 6 months ago." Clara's chest tightened. 19 years. How could anyone abandon a dog after so long? She knelt beside his cage, hesitating for a moment as she looked at him. The way he lay there, defeated, forgotten, reminded her of someone she had lost. Maybe that's why, despite everything, she felt drawn to him. "Ranger?" she called softly, her voice trembling with something she couldn't quite place. For the first time in months, his ears twitched. A small glimmer of recognition flashed in his eyes. His tail, once full of strength and energy, gave the faintest, most hesitant wag. Clara's breath caught in her throat. That tiny gesture, that fragile sign of life, was enough. And then, against all odds, she made a decision. "I'll take him," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. With that, Clara's life and Ranger's were forever intertwined. She would take him home. She would help him heal. But in doing so, she would begin to heal too. Clara Bennett hadn't planned on adopting a dog. It had been a year since her husband Daniel passed away, leaving her to navigate life in the shadow of grief. She had avoided the animal shelter for that very reason. It felt too much like a reminder of everything she had lost. Too much like the silence that haunted her empty house. The silence that made the walls feel too close, the rooms too wide. The silence that followed her everywhere she went, pressing against her chest. But today, the silence was unbearable. She could almost hear it echoing through the house. That's when, for the first time in months, Clara found herself pulling into the parking lot of Montana Haven Animal Shelter. Inside, the shelter was alive with the sounds of excitement. Dogs barked eagerly in their cages, tails wagging furiously as they greeted each passerby. The atmosphere was filled with hope, energy, and the relentless search for love. Clara couldn't help but smile weakly as she walked through the aisles, the cacophony of barking filling her ears. But then, something stopped her in her tracks. Her eyes locked onto a shadow in the farthest corner of the room. In stark contrast to the other dogs, who pulled at their cages with desperate hope, the old shepherd sat still. His body was slouched, his once pristine coat now patchy and graying. His eyes, cloudy, worn, stared into the distance, unfocused, as if he had given up waiting for something, someone. Clara's breath hitched. She couldn't explain why, but something about him, the stillness, the loneliness, pulled at her heart in a way nothing else had. He reminded her of herself. The other dogs barked loudly, some pawing at the bars of their cages, others bouncing on their hind legs. Yet the shepherd, Ranger, sat motionless, as if he were invisible to them, or perhaps even to himself. "Who is that?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though speaking louder would break the fragile moment. Ethan, the shelter owner, turned toward her and followed her gaze. His expression softened. "That's Ranger, 19 years old. His family left him here 6 months ago." Clara's heart clenched at the words. 19 years. It seemed impossible that anyone could abandon a dog after so long. A dog that had given everything, 19 years of loyalty, only to be discarded like a forgotten piece of furniture. How could they leave him? She whispered, more to herself than to Ethan. Ethan's eyes lowered, and there was a brief, almost imperceptible look of shame in his expression. He was a K9, a police dog. But when he couldn't keep up anymore, when his body started to fail, they just left him. Told me he was too old to be of use. Clara's chest tightened as if something inside her had broken. She could feel the weight of that abandonment, the cruelty of it, deep in her bones. But it wasn't just Ranger's pain that spoke to her. It was the raw, undeniable truth that in some way she understood him. She knew the feeling of being discarded, of being left behind. She had lived with that feeling for the past year, since Daniel's sudden death had torn apart the life they had built together. She felt a strange, quiet bond with the old dog. He wasn't just an animal in a shelter. He was a survivor. And somehow she knew he needed her just as much as she needed him. Clara stepped closer to his cage, crouching down so that she was eye level with him. Her eyes met his, those cloudy, lost eyes, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. His expression didn't change, but in the stillness, there was a flicker of something, a recognition, perhaps? Or was it simply a desire for connection, for comfort, for something familiar? "Ranger?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with emotion. The dog's ears twitched slightly. It was the smallest movement, but it was enough. Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was the first sign of life, the first indication that he wasn't entirely gone. She reached through the bars of the cage, offering him her hand. He didn't pull away. He didn't retreat into the corner like he had with others. He simply stared at her, as if trying to decide whether she was another false promise or someone who might actually stay. For the first time in months, Clara felt something stir inside her. She wasn't sure what it was. Hope, perhaps, or the faintest spark of belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she thought she was. "I'll take him," she said, more to herself than anyone else, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Clara's words hung in the air, echoing around the shelter, and a sense of peace washed over her. It was a decision born not just from compassion, but from something deeper. She had taken a step toward healing. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. When Clara carried Ranger into her home, the weight of his body felt impossibly heavy in her arms. He was frail, fragile, and completely unresponsive. His once strong frame now seemed to crumble against her, his bones protruding under the thin, patchy coat that barely covered his skin. She had done her best to make her home as welcoming as possible. Soft blankets, a cushioned dog bed by the window, where sunlight would stream through the curtains in the morning. But it didn't seem to matter to him. She placed him gently on the bed, hoping to see a flicker of recognition, even the smallest sign of acknowledgement. But Ranger didn't move. His eyes remained vacant, distant, locked on something that only he could see. Clara tried everything she could think of. She filled his water bowl with fresh water, made him a warm broth, and gently coaxed him with soft words, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay, Ranger. You're safe now. I'm here." But still he remained motionless, staring at nothing. A quiet, hopeless sadness filled the room, a feeling that mirrored the hollowness she'd felt in her own heart for the past year. Exhausted, Clara collapsed on the couch. She had tried so hard to make him feel at home, but it was as though nothing she did would break through the wall that surrounded him. She closed her eyes, the weight of the day pulling her into a deep, troubled sleep. Hours later, a sound broke through the stillness of the house, a low, broken whimper. Clara jolted awake, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up quickly, disoriented, her breath catching in her throat as she listened. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. A whimper so filled with sorrow that it felt as if the air itself was mourning. She stood up and moved cautiously toward the hallway. There, in the dim light from the living room, Ranger stood rigid, his body tense, his head slightly tilted as he stared intently at something. Clara's breath caught in her throat when she followed his gaze. It was a photo on the wall, an old picture of Daniel smiling at the camera, arms around Clara as they stood in front of their house, their life together captured in a moment of happiness. And then the sound came again, a soft, mournful whimper that seemed to echo through the silence of the house. Clara froze, her mind racing. Why was he reacting to a man he'd never met? Ranger had only been in her life for a day. He had never known Daniel. So why was he so fixated on this photo? She took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ranger," she called softly, her voice trembling with confusion and concern. The dog didn't move, didn't even glance at her. His focus remained on the photo, his body rigid, as if caught between two worlds, one where he had once been a warrior, and another that was foreign and unknown to him. A chill ran down Clara's spine. Was it possible that somehow, in the deepest recesses of his memory, Ranger recognized something? Or was it simply the eeriness of the moment, the odd connection between the man in the photo and the dog who had been left to die? Clara reached out slowly, her hand trembling as she placed it on Ranger's back. The moment her fingers made contact, he flinched but didn't pull away. His whimpers grew softer, quieter until they disappeared altogether. She knelt down beside him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what's happening, but you're not alone anymore. I'm here. I'll help you." Ranger's body seemed to relax ever so slightly at the sound of her voice. Clara reached for the photo on the wall, her fingers brushing over the glass. A sudden, fleeting thought struck her. Could it be that Ranger somehow sensed Daniel's presence in the house? It was crazy, but there was something about his reaction that made her wonder. For now, she couldn't explain it. She didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain. Ranger needed her, just as much as she needed him. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to help each other heal. The decision to track down Ranger's past was not one Clara made lightly. Something deep within her told her that understanding his history, his real history, was crucial. She needed to know why he had been abandoned. It wasn't just about his age or his frailty. It was about what he had once been and what he had endured. After hours of research and a few phone calls, Clara found the name of Ranger's previous owners, Richard and Margaret Hayes. They had been living in a small town on the outskirts of Montana, and Clara was determined to visit them. The idea of uncovering the truth filled her with a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. What could have led someone to leave a dog who had spent 19 years serving them? When Clara arrived at their home, a small weathered farmhouse surrounded by open fields, she felt an unsettling sense of foreboding. Richard Hayes answered the door, a graying man in his late 50s with deep lines etched into his face. His expression was guarded, weary, as though he'd expected this visit, or perhaps feared it. "I'm Clara Bennett," she introduced herself, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside. I adopted Ranger, the German Shepherd. I'm trying to understand why he was left at the shelter." Richard's eyes flashed with something unreadable. Guilt, maybe? He stepped back, allowing her inside. His wife, Margaret, was sitting by the fireplace, knitting, but she didn't look up as they entered. Clara noticed the tension in the room. It was as if the walls themselves were holding on to some secret that neither Richard nor Margaret were willing to share. Clara sat across from Richard, her heart pounding as she waited for him to speak. After a long silence, he finally sighed and leaned forward, his eyes not meeting hers. "He wasn't just a pet," he said slowly, his voice thick with reluctance. "He was a K9, my partner." Clara's breath caught. A police dog. That explains so much. His unwavering discipline, his alertness, his intensity. It was no wonder he had been so silent, so detached when she first brought him home. His life had been one of duty, of service. And now to be abandoned? It seemed almost criminal. Richard paused, as if searching for the right words, but none seemed to come. Finally he continued, his voice low, filled with regret. His name wasn't always Ranger. It was Viper. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Viper. It sounded fitting somehow, fierce, sharp. A name suited to a warrior, to a dog who had once been part of something bigger than himself. "Viper?" Clara whispered, the name resonating in her mind. "You named him after a snake? After everything he did for you?" She couldn't keep the edge of anger from creeping into her voice. How could anyone think of a dog like that as just an object, something to be discarded? Richard shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't just any dog. He was part of an elite unit, one of the best. He saved lives, Clara, more times than I can count. But once he got older, things changed. He couldn't keep up. His health started to fail, and I didn't want to deal with it. So, we left him. We left him at the shelter. Clara's pulse roared in her ears, a surge of disbelief and rage threatening to overwhelm her. She had always known there were cracks in the story, but this was more than she had bargained for. How could someone who had shared so much time with a dog, who had relied on that dog to save lives, simply abandon him? Why didn't you tell the shelter about his past? Clara demanded, her voice breaking the silence in the room like a sharp blade. Why didn't you tell them he was a K9, that he had served you? Richard's eyes flickered to the floor, his guilt painfully apparent. Because no one would want an old broken dog like him. He wasn't the same anymore. He couldn't do the things he was trained to do. And people want young, healthy dogs. They don't want a dog who's been used up. Clara's hands clenched into fists, the anger rising within her like a tidal wave. He gave you everything, and you threw him away like trash. The words burned in her throat, but she couldn't hold them back. How could he even justify it? How could anyone be so heartless? Richard flinched at her words, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. The truth hung in the air like a heavy weight. Do you have any idea what it's like? Clara continued, her voice quivering with emotion. To be left behind by the one person who was supposed to care for you? To be abandoned after you've given your all? Richard's eyes softened, but it wasn't enough to quell Clara's fury. She had no sympathy left for him, not for his guilt, not for his regrets. Ranger had trusted these people. He had given them his life, and they had just tossed him aside without a second thought. You don't get to call him broken, Clara said coldly, standing up and turning to leave. Not when he's the one who's been broken by you. As Clara stepped outside, the weight of her words hung in the air. She didn't know what had driven Richard and Margaret to do what they did, but she did know one thing. Ranger wasn't broken. Ranger was a survivor, and she was going to give him the chance to prove that. Days turned into weeks, and in those weeks, something remarkable happened. Ranger, no longer the broken shell of a dog he had once been, began to show signs of life. At first, it was small things. A cautious step toward Clara as she moved about the house, a wag of his tail in response to her voice, and most significantly, he started eating again. The first time he finished an entire bowl of food, Clara had nearly cried in relief. With every passing day, Ranger's strength seemed to grow. He started following her from room to room, his once sluggish steps becoming more steady. His eyes, though still clouded with age and pain, had a new softness in them. Clara could see the connection between them deepening. She no longer felt like the only one trying to save him. But no matter how much better Ranger seemed, there was always that nagging fear at the back of Clara's mind. His past, the damage done to his body and spirit, had left marks that couldn't be erased. Ranger was aging, and the fight wasn't over yet. One morning, Clara woke up to find him lying still on the porch, his chest rising and falling slowly. It didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary at first, but as the hours wore on, Clara noticed that Ranger wasn't getting up. He wasn't moving at all. She called his name gently, But when he didn't respond, panic seized her. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she tried to coax him up, but his body was heavy, unresponsive. "Ranger," she whispered, kneeling beside him. His eyes flickered open, dull and weary, but there was no strength in them. He didn't even try to lift his head. In a frenzy, Clara grabbed the phone and called the vet. Within the hour, they were in the clinic. The vet, a woman with kind eyes, gave Ranger a thorough examination. Clara waited in the sterile, white-walled room, heart pounding with every passing second. Finally, the vet turned to face her. Her expression was grim, her lips pressed together as though she hated having to speak the words she was about to say. "His body is shutting down, Clara," the vet said softly. "His age, combined with the wear and tear from his time as a K9, has taken a toll. His organs are starting to fail." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her world seemed to tilt sideways, and the room grew unbearably still. For a moment, it felt as though she couldn't breathe, like the air had been sucked out of her chest. "Is he in pain?" Clara whispered, the question barely leaving her lips. She couldn't bear the thought of him suffering. The vet shook her head, her voice soft with sympathy. "Not right now. He's still fighting, but it won't be long before he reaches a point where there's nothing more we can do. At that point, it'll be your choice." Her eyes softened as she placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "You have to decide whether to let him go peacefully or keep fighting for however long he can hang on." Clara's vision blurred, the tears threatening to spill over. Fighting. That's what they had done. Every day had been a battle, not just for Ranger's physical health, but for his will to live. And now it seemed like that fight was coming to an end. How could she make this choice? She looked down at Ranger, who lay in the examination room with his body still, his breaths slow and labored. His eyes, once sharp and focused, were now unfocused, tired. His time was running out. Clara's heart broke at the thought. The memories of how he had looked when he first came into her home, the broken, distant dog who had barely seemed alive, flashed before her eyes. But now he was more than that. Ranger had come back to life. He had fought for her, and she had fought for him. "We fight," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. The vet nodded quietly, understanding the choice Clara had made. She didn't have to say more. Clara was going to fight for Ranger until the very end. She sat beside him, resting her hand on his side, and he seemed to respond in the slightest way, shifting his weight so that his body rested against hers. For a brief moment, Clara felt a flicker of hope. No matter what happened next, she wasn't going to give up on him. Miracles never seemed grand or sudden with Ranger. They came quietly, in small, almost imperceptible moments. At first, it was a flicker of recognition when Clara spoke his name, his ears twitching slightly, his eyes softening, as if he were remembering something distant, something familiar. Then a hesitant lick to her hand when she reached out to comfort him. The once indifferent dog, the one who barely responded to her presence, now sought her out in his own subtle way. Every day brought something new, something that hinted at the dog Ranger had once been. A slow, cautious wag of his tail when she entered the room. A quiet grunt of satisfaction when she fed him his favorite treats. He wasn't the lifeless, abandoned soul she had first brought home. He was returning to life, bit by bit. But nothing prepared Clara for that one morning. She had woken early, the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. She moved quietly, as she always did, not wanting to disturb Ranger. As she passed the open door to the porch, she froze. Ranger was standing, not slumped or lying down as he had for days, but standing on shaky legs, his frail body trembling with the effort. It was a small movement, a small victory, but to Clara, it felt like the world had shifted. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her heart raced in her chest, her emotions so overwhelming that she felt lightheaded. Ranger was standing on his own. After everything he had been through, after months of feeling broken, abandoned, forgotten, he was standing. He swayed slightly, his legs uncertain beneath him, but his determination was clear. His tail, stiff at first, began to move, a slow, hesitant wag, as though he was testing the world around him. The dog that had been so still, so detached, was finally showing signs of life. Clara stepped forward cautiously, her heart swelling with a love so deep it almost hurt. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she placed them gently on his sides, supporting him. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a spark there. Not just the dull resignation that had filled them before, but something more. Hope. "You did it," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She could barely choke out the words. Tears spilled down her face, falling onto his fur as she gazed at him in awe. "You did it, Ranger. You're back." The sound of his tail wagging grew stronger, more confident, as he shifted his weight from one side to the other. With a tentative step, he moved forward, inching closer to the edge of the porch. The act of walking seemed impossible just days ago, yet here he was, fighting, living, breathing. And then Clara realized something even more profound. Ranger wasn't Viper anymore. He wasn't the tough, battle-worn dog that had once been a K9. He wasn't the dog who had been abandoned by the very people he had served. He was Ranger now, the dog who had found a new home, a new purpose, and he wasn't waiting to die. He was living, one step at a time. The healing wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. Ranger was reclaiming his life, piece by piece. Clara wiped her tears away, a smile breaking through the sadness that had held her heart captive for so long. She stayed by his side as he continued to stand, taking small, careful steps forward. "You're home now," Clara whispered, her voice barely a breath. "You're finally home." For the first time, Clara felt the full weight of the journey they had both been on. Ranger's battle had never been just about surviving. It had been about finding someone who would believe in him again, someone who would fight for him, no matter how far gone he seemed. And in turn, Ranger had fought for Clara in his own way, fighting not just to survive, but to live. Months passed, and with each day, Clara and Ranger grew closer. What had started as an act of compassion, rescuing a broken dog from the shelter, had transformed into something far deeper. They had become each other's family, healing in ways neither could have anticipated. It was a quiet afternoon when Clara found herself sitting outside, her back against the porch railing, the golden Montana sun warming her face. She could hear the distant hum of bees buzzing lazily through the wildflower, the rustling of the trees in the gentle breeze. The world seemed to slow down, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, savoring this simple moment. And there, by her side, lay Ranger. His once tired body had become stronger, more confident, though still frail with age. His golden fur, though sparse in places, had a soft, shiny glow in the sunlight. He was no longer the weary, broken dog she had rescued months ago. He was a companion, a friend. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she stroked his fur, her fingers gently working through the soft patches of hair that remained. Ranger was lying on the porch beside her, his head resting on her lap. His breathing was steady, almost rhythmic, a sign of the comfort he had finally found in his new life. His eyes, though clouded with age, had a tranquility to them. They were no longer filled with the sadness and uncertainty that had once defined them. They were at peace. Clara smiled softly, her heart full as she looked down at him. It had been a long, hard journey, one filled with obstacles, pain, and uncertainty. But now, looking at Ranger, she knew they had both made it through to the other side. He wasn't the same dog she had brought home, and she wasn't the same person either. She whispered to him, the words soft and loving. "You're not forgotten," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Not anymore." She thought back to the first time she had seen him, how his eyes had been lifeless, how his body had been frail and reluctant to move. But now, under the sun, with her hand resting gently on his side, Ranger wasn't just surviving, he was living. For the first time in years, Clara felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. She didn't need to hold on to the past. Ranger's past, the one that had left him broken and abandoned, was no longer a burden they both had to carry. He was here now, with her, and he had found his place. As Clara continued to stroke his fur, a soft sigh escaped her lips. The bond they had forged had become something unbreakable. And in this quiet moment, under the golden Montana sun, it felt as though the world had faded away. It was just her and Ranger, two souls that had found each other when they both needed saving. Ranger, for the first time in years, closed his eyes. It wasn't the quiet surrender of a dog waiting for the end. It was the peaceful rest of a dog who had found his home. A dog who had been loved and cared for. A dog who had truly lived. And Clara, sitting beside him, felt a peace of her own. She didn't need to fear losing him, because in this moment, she knew he had already found everything he had been searching for: love, belonging, and a place to call home.